Chapter 46 of Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 46. Mr Slope's parting interview with the Signora. On the following day the Signora was in her pride. She was dressed in her brightest of mourning dresses, and had quite a levee round her couch. It was a beautifully bright October afternoon. All the gentlemen of the neighbourhood were in Barchester, and those who had the entry of Dr Stanhope's house were in the Signora's back drawing-room. Charlotte and Mrs Stanhope were in the front room, and such of the ladies' squires as could not for the moment get near the centre of attraction had to waste their fragrance on the mother and sister. The first who came, and the last to leave, was Mr Arabin. This was the second visit he had paid to Madame Neroni since he had met her at Ullathorne. He came, he knew not why, to talk about he knew not what. But, in truth, the feelings which now troubled him were new to him, and he could not analyse them. It may seem strange that he should thus come dangling about Madame Neroni, because he was in love with Mrs Bold, but it was nevertheless the fact, and though he could not understand why he did so, Madame Neroni understood it well enough. She had been gentle and kind to him, and had encouraged his staying. Therefore he stayed on. She pressed his hand when he first greeted her. She made him remain near her, and whispered to him little nothings. And then her eye, brilliant and bright, now mirthful, now melancholy, and invincible in either way. What man with warm feelings, blood unchilled, and a heart not guarded by a triple steel of experience, could have withstood those eyes? The lady, it is true, intended to do him no mortal injury. She merely chose to inhale a slight breath of incense before she handed the casket over to another. Whether Mrs Bold would willingly have spared even so much is another question. And then came Mr Slope. All the world now knew that Mr Slope was a candidate for the Deanery, and that he was generally considered to be the favourite. Mr Slope, therefore, walked rather largely upon the earth. He gave to himself a portly air, such as might become a dean, spoke but little to other clergymen, and shunned the bishop as much as possible. How the meagre little prebendary, and the burly chancellor, and all the minor canons and vicars choral, and all the choristers too, cowered and shook, and walked about with long faces, when they read or heard of that article in the Jupiter. Now were coming the days when nothing would avail to keep the impure spirit from the cathedral pulpit. That pulpit would indeed be his own. Precentors, vicars, and choristers might hang up their harps on the willows. Ichabod, Ichabod, the glory of their house was departing from them. Mr Slope, great as he was with embryo grandeur, still came to see the Signora. Indeed, he could not keep himself away. He dreamt of that soft hand which he had kissed so often, and of that imperial brow which his lips had once pressed, and he then dreamt also of further favours. And Mr Thorne was there also. It was the first visit he had ever paid to the Signora, and he made it not without due preparation. Mr Thorne was a gentleman usually precise in his dress, and prone to make the most of himself in an unpretending way. The grey hairs in his whiskers were eliminated perhaps once a month. Those on his head were softened by a mixture which we will not call a dye. It was only a wash. His tailor lived in St James's Street, and his bootmaker at the corner of that street and Piccadilly. He was particular in the article of gloves, and the getting up of his shirts was a matter not lightly thought of in the Ullathorne laundry. On the occasion of the present visit, he had rather overdone his usual efforts, and caused some little uneasiness to his sister, who had not hitherto received very cordially the proposition for a lengthened visit from the Signora at Ullathorne. There were others also there, young men about the city, who had not much to do, and who were induced by the lady's charms to neglect that little; but all gave way to Mr Thorne, who was somewhat of a grand signor, as a country gentleman always is in a provincial city. "Oh, Mr Thorne, this is so kind of you," said the Signora. "You promised to come, but I really did not expect it. I thought you country gentlemen never kept your pledges."
"Oh, yes, sometimes,"
said Mr Thorne, looking rather sheepish, and making his salutations a little too much in the style of the last century. "You deceive none but your what do you call the people that carry you about in chairs, and pelt you with eggs and apples when they make you a member of Parliament?" "One another also sometimes, Signora," said Mr Slope, with a very Deanish sort of smirk on his face. "Country gentlemen do deceive one another sometimes, don't they, Mr Thorne?" Mr Thorne gave him a look which undeaned him completely for the moment, but he soon remembered his high hopes, and recovering himself quickly, sustained his probable coming dignity by a laugh at Mr Thorne's expense.
"I never deceive a lady, at any rate," said Mr Thorne, "especially when the gratification of my own wishes is so strong an inducement to keep me true, as it now is."
Mr Thorne went on thus a while with antediluvian grimaces and compliments, which he had picked up from Sir Charles Grandison, and the Signora, at every grimace and at every bow, smiled a little smile and bowed a little bow. Mr Thorne, however, was kept standing at the foot of the couch, for the new dean sat in the seat of honour near the table. Mr Arabin, the while, was standing with his back to the fire, his coat-tails under his arms, gazing at her with all his eyes, not quite in vain, for every now and again a glance came up at him, bright as a meteor out of heaven. "Oh, Mr Thorne, you promised to let me introduce my little girl to you. Can you spare a moment? Will you see her now?"
Mr Thorne assured her that he could and would see the young lady with the greatest pleasure in life.
"Mr Slope, might I trouble you to ring the bell?" said she, and when Mr Slope got up, she looked at Mr Thorne and pointed to the chair. Mr Thorne, however, was much too slow to understand her, and Mr Slope would have recovered his seat, had not the Signora, who never chose to be unsuccessful, somewhat summarily ordered him out of it. "Oh, Mr Slope, I must ask you to let Mr Thorne sit here just for a moment or two. I am sure you will pardon me. We can take a liberty with you this week. Next week, you know, when you move into the dean's house, we shall all be afraid of you." Mr Slope, with an air of much indifference, rose from his seat, and walking into the next room, became greatly interested in Mrs Stanhope's worsted work. And then the child was brought in. She was a little girl about 8 years of age, like her mother, only that her enormous eyes were black, and her hair quite jet. Her complexion, too, was very dark, and bespoke her foreign blood. She was dressed in the most outlandish and extravagant way in which clothes could be put on a child's back. She had great bracelets on her naked little arms, a crimson fillet braided with gold round her head, and scarlet shoes with high heels. Her dress was all flounces, and stuck out from her as though the object were to make it lie off horizontally from her little hips. It did not nearly cover her knees, but this was atoned for by a loose pair of drawers, which seemed made throughout of lace. Then she had on pink silk stockings. It was thus that the last of the Neros was habitually dressed at the hour when visitors were wont to call. "Julia, my love," said the mother. Julia was ever a favourite name with the ladies of that family. "Julia, my love, come here. I was telling you about the beautiful party poor mamma went to. This is Mr Thorne. Will you give him a kiss, dearest?" Julia put up her face to be kissed, as she did to all her mother's visitors, and then Mr Thorne found that he had got her, and, what was much more terrific to him, all her finery into his arms. The lace and starch crumpled against his waistcoat and trousers, the greasy black curls hung upon his cheek, and one of the bracelet clasps scratched his ear. He did not at all know how to hold so magnificent a lady, nor, holding her, what to do with her. However, he had on other occasions been compelled to fondle little nieces and nephews, and now set about the task in the mode he always had used. "Diddle, diddle, diddle, diddle," said he, putting the child on one knee, and working away with it as though he were turning a knife grinder's wheel with his foot. "Mamma, mamma," said Julia crossly, "I don't want to be diddle-diddled. Let me go, you naughty old man, you." Poor Mr Thorne put the child down quietly on the ground, and drew back his chair. Mr Slope, who had returned to the pole star that attracted him, laughed aloud. Mr Arabin winced and shut his eyes, and the Signora pretended not to hear her daughter. "Go to Aunt Charlotte, lovey," said the mamma, "and ask her if it is not time for you to go out." But little Miss Julia, though she had not exactly liked the nature of Mr Thorne's attention, was accustomed to be played with by gentlemen, and did not relish the idea of being sent so soon to her aunt. "Julia, go when I tell you, my dear." But Julia still went pouting about the room. "Charlotte, do come and take her," said the Signora. "She must go out, and the days get so short now." And thus ended the much talked of interview between Mr Thorne and the last of the Neros. Mr Thorne recovered from the child's crossness sooner than from Mr Slope's laughter. He could put up with being called an old man by an infant, but he did not like to be laughed at by the bishop's chaplain, even though that chaplain was about to become a dean. He said nothing, but he showed plainly enough that he was angry. The Signora was ready enough to avenge him. "Mr Slope," said she, "I hear that you are triumphing on all sides." "How so?" said he, smiling. He did not dislike being talked to about the deanery, though of course he strongly denied the imputation. "You carry the day both in love and war." Mr Slope hereupon did not look quite so satisfied as he had done. "Mr Arabin," continued the Signora, "don't you think Mr Slope is a very lucky man?" "Not more so than he deserves, I am sure," said Mr Arabin. "Only think, Mr Thorne, he is to be our new dean. Of course we all know that." "Indeed, Signora," said Mr Slope, "we all know nothing about it, I can assure you. I myself—" "He is to be the new dean. There is no manner of doubt of it, Mr Thorne." "Humph!" said Mr Thorne. "Passing over the heads of old men like my father and Archdeacon Grantly." "Oh, oh!" said Mr Slope. The archdeacon would not accept it, said Mr Arabin, whereupon Mr Slope smiled abominably, and said as plainly as a look could speak that the grapes were sour. "Going over all our heads," continued the Signora, "for of course I consider myself one of the chapter." "If I am ever dean," said Mr Slope, "that is, were I ever to become so, I should glory in such a canoness." "Oh, Mr Slope, stop, I haven't half done. There is another canoness for you to glory in. Mr Slope is not only to have the deanery, but a wife to put in it." Mr Slope again looked disconcerted. "A wife with a large fortune too. It never rains but it pours, does it, Mr Thorne?" "No, never," said Mr Thorne, who did not quite relish talking about Mr Slope and his affairs. "When will it be, Mr Slope?" "When will what be?" said he. "Oh, we know when the affair of the dean will be. A week will settle that. The new hat, I have no doubt, has been already ordered. But when will the marriage come off?" "Do you mean mine or Mr Arabin's?" said he, striving to be facetious. "Well, just then I meant yours, though perhaps after all Mr Arabin's may be first. But we know nothing of him. He is too close for any of us. Now all is open and above board with you, which, by the by, Mr Arabin, I beg to tell you I like much the best. He who runs can read that Mr Slope is a favoured lover. Come, Mr Slope, when is the widow to be made Mrs Dean?" To Mr Arabin this badinage was peculiarly painful, and yet he could not tear himself away and leave it. He believed, still believed, with that sort of belief which the fear of a thing engenders, that Mrs Bold would probably become the wife of Mr Slope. Of Mr Slope's little adventure in the garden he knew nothing. For aught he knew, Mr Slope might have had an adventure of quite a different character. He might have thrown himself at the widow's feet, been accepted, and then returned to town a jolly, thriving wooer. The Signora's jokes were bitter enough to Mr Slope, but they were quite as bitter to Mr Arabin. He stood leaning against the fireplace, fumbling with his hands in his trousers pockets. "Come, come, Mr Slope, don't be so bashful," continued the Signora. "We all know that you proposed to the lady the other day at Ullathorne. Tell us with what words she accepted you. Was it with a simple yes, or with the two no-nos which make an affirmative? Or did silence give consent? Or did she speak out with that spirit which so well becomes a widow, and say openly, 'By my troth, sir, you shall make me Mrs Slope as soon as it is your pleasure to do so'?" Mr Slope had seldom in his life felt himself less at his ease. There sat Mr Thorne, laughing silently. There stood his old antagonist, Mr Arabin, gazing at him with all his eyes. There, round the door between the two rooms, were clustered a little group of people, including Miss Stanhope and the Revs, Messrs Grey and Green, all listening to his discomfiture. He knew that it depended solely on his own wit whether or no he could throw the joke back upon the lady. He knew that it stood him to do so if he possibly could, but he had not a word. 'Tis conscience that makes cowards of us all. He felt on his cheek the sharp points of Eleanor's fingers, and did not know who might have seen the blow, who might have told the tale to this pestilent woman who took such delight in jeering him.
He stood there, therefore, red as a carbuncle and mute as a fish, grinning sufficiently to show his teeth, an object of pity. But the Signora had no pity. She knew nothing of mercy. Her present object was to put Mr Slope down, and she was determined to do it thoroughly, now that she had him in her power. What, Mr Slope? No answer? Why, it can't possibly be that the woman has been fool enough to refuse you. She can't surely be looking out after a bishop. But I see how it is, Mr Slope. Widows are proverbially cautious. You should have let her alone till the new hat was on your head, till you could show her the key of the deanery. Signora, said he at last, trying to speak in a tone of dignified reproach, you really permit yourself to talk on solemn subjects in a very improper way. Solemn subjects? What solemn subject? Surely a dean's hat is not such a solemn subject. I have no aspirations such as those you impute to me. Perhaps you will drop the subject. Oh, certainly, Mr Slope, but one word first. Go to her again with the Prime Minister's letter in your pocket. I'll wager my shawl to your shovel. She does not refuse you then. I must say, Signora, that I think you are speaking of the lady in a very unjustifiable manner. And one other piece of advice, Mr Slope. I'll only offer you one other. And then she commenced singing. It's good to be merry and wise, Mr Slope. It's good to be honest and true. It's good to be off with the old love, Mr Slope, before you are on with the new. And the Signora, throwing herself back on her sofa, laughed merrily. She little recked how those who heard her would in their own imaginations fill up the little history of Mr Slope's first love. She little cared that some among them might attribute to her the honour of his earlier admiration. She was tired of Mr Slope, and wanted to get rid of him. She had ground for anger with him, and she chose to be revenged. How Mr Slope got out of that room he never himself knew. He did succeed ultimately, and probably with some assistance, in getting his hat and escaping into the air. At last his love for the Signora was cured. Whenever he again thought of her in his dreams, it was not as of an angel with azure wings. He connected her rather with fire and brimstone, and though he could still believe her to be a spirit, he banished her entirely out of heaven, and found a place for her among the infernal gods. When he weighed in the balance, as he not seldom did, the two women to whom he had attached himself in Barchester, the pre-eminent place in his soul's hatred was usually allotted to the Signora. End of chapter 46. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 47 of Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 47. The Dean Elect. During the entire next week, Barchester was ignorant who was to be its new dean. On Sunday morning, Mr Slope was decidedly the favourite, but he did not show himself in the cathedral, and then he sank a point or two in the betting. On Monday he got a scolding from the bishop in the hearing of the servants, and down he went till nobody would have him at any price.
but on Tuesday he received a letter in an official cover marked private, by which he fully recovered his place in the public favour. On Wednesday he was said to be ill, and that did not look well. But on Thursday morning he went down to the railway station with a very jaunty air, and when it was ascertained that he had taken a first-class ticket for London, there was no longer any room for doubt on the matter. While matters were in this state of ferment at Barchester, there was not much mental comfort at Plumstead. Our friend the Archdeacon had many grounds for inward grief.
He was much displeased at the result of Dr. Gwynne's diplomatic mission to the palace, and did not even scruple to say to his wife that had he gone himself, he would have managed the affair much better.
His wife did not agree with him, but that did not mend the matter. Mr Quiverful's appointment to the hospital was, however, a fait accompli, and Mr Harding's acquiescence in that appointment was not less so. Nothing would induce Mr Harding to make a public appeal against the bishop, and the Master of Lazarus quite approved of his not doing so.
"I don't know what has come to the master,"
said the Archdeacon over and over again.
"He used to be ready enough to stand up for his order."
"My dear Archdeacon," Mrs Grantly would say in reply, "what is the use of always fighting? I really think the master is right." The master, however, had taken steps of his own, of which neither the Archdeacon nor his wife knew anything. Then Mr Slope's successes were henbane to Dr Grantly, and Mrs Bold's improprieties were as bad.
"What would be all the world to Archdeacon Grantly if Mr Slope should become Dean of Barchester and marry his wife's sister?"
He talked of it and talked of it till he was nearly ill. Mrs Grantly almost wished that the marriage were done and over, so that she might hear no more about it.
And there was yet another ground of misery, which cut him to the quick nearly as closely as either of the others. That paragon of a clergyman, whom he had bestowed upon St Ewold's, that college friend of whom he had boasted so loudly, that ecclesiastical knight before whose lance Mr Slope was to fall and bite the dust, that worthy bulwark of the church as it should be, that honoured representative of Oxford's best spirit, was, so at least his wife had told him 6 times, misconducting himself.
Nothing had been seen of Mr Arabin at Plumstead for the last week, but a good deal had unfortunately been heard of him. As soon as Mrs Grantly had found herself alone with the Archdeacon on the evening of the Ullathorne party, she had expressed herself very forcibly as to Mr Arabin's conduct on that occasion. He had, she declared, looked and acted and talked very unlike a decent parish clergyman.
At first the Archdeacon had laughed at this, and assured her that she need not trouble herself, that Mr Arabin would be found to be quite safe. But by degrees he began to find that his wife's eyes had been sharper than his own.
Other people coupled the Signora's name with that of Mr Arabin. The meagre little prebendary who lived in the close told him to a nicety how often Mr Arabin had visited at Dr Stanhope's, and how long he had remained on the occasion of each visit. He had asked after Mr Arabin at the cathedral library, and an officious little vicar choral had offered to go and see whether he could be found at Dr Stanhope's. Rumour when she has contrived to sound the first note on her trumpet, soon makes a loud peal audible enough. It was too clear that Mr Arabin had succumbed to the Italian woman, and that the archdeacon's credit would suffer fearfully if something were not done to rescue the brand from the burning. Besides, to give the archdeacon his due, he was really attached to Mr Arabin, and grieved greatly at his backsliding. They were sitting talking over their sorrows in the drawing room before dinner on the day after Mr Slope's departure for London, and on this occasion Mrs Grantly spoke out her mind freely. She had opinions of her own about parish clergymen, and now thought it right to give vent to them. "If you would have been led by me, archdeacon, you would never have put a bachelor into St Ewold's."
"But, my dear, you don't mean to say that all bachelor clergymen misbehave themselves?"
"I don't know that clergymen are so much better than other men," said Mrs Grantly. "It's all very well with a curate whom you have under your own eye, and whom you can get rid of if he persists in improprieties."
"But Mr Arabin was a fellow, and couldn't have had a wife."
"Then I would have found someone who could."
"But, my dear, are fellows never to get livings?"
"Yes, to be sure they are, when they get engaged. I never would put a young man into a living unless he were married, or engaged to be married. Now here is Mr Arabin. The whole responsibility lies upon you."
"There is not at this moment a clergyman in all Oxford more respected for morals and conduct than Arabin."
"Oh, Oxford!" said the lady with a sneer. "What men choose to do at Oxford nobody ever hears of. A man may do very well at Oxford who would bring disgrace on a parish; and to tell you the truth, it seems to me that Mr Arabin is just such a man." The archdeacon groaned deeply, but he had no further answer to make. "You really must speak to him, archdeacon. Only think what the Thornes will say if they hear that their parish clergyman spends his whole time philandering with this woman." The archdeacon groaned again. He was a courageous man, and knew well enough how to rebuke the younger clergyman of the diocese when necessary; but there was that about Mr Arabin which made the doctor feel that it would be very difficult to rebuke him with good effect. "You can advise him to find a wife for himself, and he will understand well enough what that means," said Mrs Grantly. The archdeacon had nothing for it but groaning.
"There was Mr Slope. He was going to be made dean. He was going to take a wife. He was about to achieve respectability and wealth, an excellent family mansion, and a family carriage. He would soon be among the comfortable elite of the ecclesiastical world of Barchester, whereas his own protégé, the true scion of the true church, by whom he had sworn, would be still but a poor vicar, and that with a very indifferent character for moral conduct. It might be all very well recommending Mr Arabin to marry, but how would Mr Arabin, when married, support a wife? Things were ordering themselves thus in Plumstead drawing room, when Dr and Mrs Grantly were disturbed in their sweet discourse by the quick rattle of a carriage and pair of horses on the gravel sweep. The sound was not that of visitors, whose private carriages are generally brought up to country house doors with demure propriety, but betokened rather the advent of some person or persons who were in a hurry to reach the house,
and had no intention of immediately leaving it. Guests invited to stay a week, and who were conscious of arriving after the first dinner bell, would probably approach in such a manner. So might arrive an attorney with the news of a granduncle's death, or a son from college with all the fresh honours of a double first. No one would have had himself driven up to the door of a country house in such a manner who had the slightest doubt of his own right to force an entry. "Who is it?" said Mrs Grantly, looking at her husband.
"Who on earth can it be?"
said the archdeacon to his wife. He then quietly got up and stood with the drawing-room door open in his hand.
"Why, it's your father!"
It was indeed Mr Harding, and Mr Harding alone. He had come by himself in a post-chaise with a couple of horses from Barchester, arriving almost after dark, and evidently full of news. His visits had usually been made in the quietest manner. He had rarely presumed to come without notice, and had always been driven up in a modest old green fly, with one horse, that hardly made itself heard as it crawled up to the hall door.
"Good gracious, Warden, is it you?"
said the archdeacon, forgetting in his surprise the events of the last few years.
"But come in. Nothing the matter, I hope?"
"We are very glad you are come, papa," said his daughter. "I'll go and get your room ready at once."
"I an't warden, archdeacon," said Mr Harding. "Mr Quiverful is warden."
"Oh, I know,"
said the archdeacon petulantly.
"I forgot all about it at the moment. Is anything the matter?"
"Don't go this moment, Susan," said Mr Harding. "I have something to tell you."
"The dinner bell will ring in 5 minutes," said she.
"Will it?" said Mr Harding. "Then perhaps I had better wait." He was big with news which he had come to tell, but which he knew could not be told without much discussion. He had hurried away to Plumstead as fast as 2 horses could bring him, and now, finding himself there, he was willing to accept the reprieve which dinner would give him.
"If you have anything of moment to tell us," said the archdeacon, "pray let us hear it at once. Has Eleanor gone off?"
"No, she has not," said Mr Harding, with a look of great displeasure.
"Has Slope been made dean?"
"No, he has not, but—"
"But what?"
said the archdeacon, who was becoming very impatient.
"They have what?"
said the archdeacon.
"They have offered it to me," said Mr Harding, with a modesty which almost prevented his speaking.
"Good heavens!"
said the archdeacon, and sunk back exhausted in an easy chair. "My dear, dear father," said Mrs Grantly, and threw her arms round her father's neck.
"So I thought I had better come out and consult with you at once," said Mr Harding.
"Consult!"
shouted the archdeacon.
"But, my dear Harding, I congratulate you with my whole heart, I do indeed. I never heard anything in my life that gave me so much pleasure."
And he got hold of both his father-in-law's hands and shook them as though he were going to shake them off, and walked round and round the room, twirling a copy of the Jupiter over his head to show his extreme exultation.
"But—" began Mr Harding.
"But me no buts," said the archdeacon. "I never was so happy in my life. It was just the proper thing to do. Upon my honour, I'll never say another word against Lord Dash the longest day I have to live."
"That's Dr Gwynne's doing, you may be sure," said Mrs Grantly, who greatly liked the Master of Lazarus. he being an orderly married man with a large family.
"I suppose it is," said the archdeacon.
"Oh, papa, I am so truly delighted," said Mrs Grantly, getting up and kissing her father. "But, my dear," said Mr Harding. It was all in vain that he strove to speak. Nobody would listen to him.
"Well, Mr Dean," said the archdeacon, triumphing, "the Deanery gardens will be some consolation for the hospital elms. Well, poor Quiverful, I won't begrudge him his good fortune any longer."
"No, indeed," said Mrs Grantly. "Poor woman, she has 14 children. I am sure I am very glad they have got it."
"So am I,"
said Mr Harding.
"I would give £20," said the archdeacon, "to see how Mr Slope will look when he hears it."
The idea of Mr Slope's discomfiture formed no small part of the archdeacon's pleasure. At last Mr Harding was allowed to go upstairs and wash his hands, having in fact said very little of all that he had come out to Plumstead on purpose to say. Nor could anything more be said till the servants were gone after dinner. The joy of Dr Grantly was so uncontrollable that he could not refrain from calling his father-in-law
"Mr Dean"
before the men, and therefore it was soon matter of discussion in the lower regions how Mr Harding, instead of his daughter's future husband, was to be the new dean, and various were the opinions on the matter. The cook and butler, who were advanced in years, thought that it was just as it should be, but the footman and lady's maid, who were younger, thought it was a great shame that Mr Slope should lose his chance.
"He's a mean chap all the same," said the footman, "and it an't along of him that I says so, but I always did admire the missus's sister, and she'd well become the situation."
While these were the ideas downstairs, a very great difference of opinion existed above. As soon as the cloth was drawn and the wine on the table, Mr Harding made for himself an opportunity of speaking. It was, however, with much inward troubling that he said, "It's very kind of Lord Dash, very kind, and I feel it deeply, most deeply. I am, I must confess, gratified by the offer."
"I should think so,"
said the archdeacon, "but all the same I am afraid that I can't accept it." The decanter almost fell from the archdeacon's hand upon the table, and the start he made was so great as to make his wife jump up from her chair.
"Not accept the deanship! If it really ended in this, there would be no longer any doubt that his father-in-law was demented. The question now was whether a clergyman with low rank, and preferment amounting to less than £200 a year, should accept high rank, £1,200 a year, and one of the most desirable positions which his profession had to afford. What?"
said the archdeacon, gasping for breath, and staring at his guest as though the violence of his emotion had almost thrown him into a fit.
"What?"
"I do not find myself fit for new duties," urged Mr Harding.
"New duties? What duties?"
said the archdeacon with unintended sarcasm. "Oh, papa," said Mrs Grantly, "nothing can be easier than what a dean has to do. Surely you are more active than Dr Trefoil."
"He won't have half as much to do as he has at present," said Dr Grantly.
"Did you see what the Jupiter said the other day about young men?"
"Yes, and I saw that the Jupiter said all that it could to induce the appointment of Mr Slope. Perhaps you would wish to see Mr Slope made dean."
Mr Harding made no reply to this rebuke, though he felt it strongly.
He had not come over to Plumstead to have further contention with his son-in-law about Mr Slope, so he allowed it to pass by. "I know I cannot make you understand my feeling," he said, "for we have been cast in different moulds. I may wish that I had your spirit and energy and power of combating, but I have not. Every day that is added to my life increases my wish for peace and rest." "And where on earth can a man have peace and rest, if not in a deanery?" said the archdeacon. "People will say that I am too old for it." "Good heavens! People? What people? What need you care for any people?" "But I think myself I am too old for any new place." "Dear papa," said Mrs Grantly, "men 10 years older than you are appointed to new situations day after day." "My dear," said he, "it is impossible that I should make you understand my feelings, nor do I pretend to any great virtue in the matter. The truth is, I want the force of character which might enable me to stand against the spirit of the times. The call on all sides now is for young men, and I have not the nerve to put myself in opposition to the demand. Were the Jupiter, when it hears of my appointment, to write article after article setting forth my incompetency, I am sure it would cost me my reason. I ought to be able to bear with such things, you will say. Well, my dear, I own that I ought, but I feel my weakness, and I know that I can't. And to tell you the truth, I know no more than a child what the dean has to do."
"Pshaw!"
exclaimed the archdeacon. "Don't be angry with me, archdeacon. Don't let us quarrel about it, Susan. If you knew how keenly I feel the necessity of having to disoblige you in this matter, you would not be angry with me." This was a dreadful blow to Dr Grantly. Nothing could possibly have suited him better than having Mr Harding in the deanery. Though he had never looked down on Mr Harding on account of his recent poverty, he did fully recognize the satisfaction of having those belonging to him in comfortable positions. It would be much more suitable that Mr Harding should be Dean of Barchester than Vicar of St Cuthbert's and precentor to boot. And then the great discomfiture of that arch enemy of all that was respectable in Barchester, of that new low church clerical parvenu that had fallen amongst them, that alone would be worth more almost than the situation itself. It was frightful to think that such unhoped for good fortune should be marred by the absurd crotchets and unwholesome hallucinations by which Mr Harding allowed himself to be led astray. To have the cup so near his lips, and then to lose the drinking of it, was more than Dr Grantly could endure. And yet it appeared as though he would have to endure it. In vain he threatened, and in vain he coaxed. Mr Harding did not indeed speak with perfect decision of refusing the proffered glory, but he would not speak with anything like decision of accepting it. When pressed again and again, he would again and again allege that he was wholly unfitted to new duties. It was in vain that the archdeacon tried to insinuate, though he could not plainly declare, that there were no new duties to perform. It was in vain he hinted that in all cases of difficulty he he, the Archdeacon, was willing and able to guide a weak-minded dean. Mr Harding seemed to have a foolish idea, not only that there were new duties to do, but that no one should accept the place who was not himself prepared to do them.
The conference ended in an understanding that Mr Harding should at once acknowledge the letter he had received from the minister's private secretary, and should beg that he might be allowed 2 days to make up his mind, and that during those 2 days the matter should be considered. On the following morning the Archdeacon was to drive Mr Harding back to Barchester. End of chapter 47. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 48 of Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 48. Miss Thorne shows her talent at matchmaking. On Mr Harding's return to Barchester from Plumstead, which was effected by him in due course in company with the Archdeacon, more tidings of a surprising nature met him. He was, during the journey, subjected to such a weight of unanswerable argument,
all of which went to prove that it was his bounden duty not to interfere with the paternal government that was so anxious to make him a dean,
that when he arrived at the chemist's door in High Street, he hardly knew which way to turn himself in the matter.
But, perplexed as he was doomed to further perplexity. He found a note there from his daughter, begging him most urgently to come to her immediately. But we must again go back a little in our story. Miss Thorne had not been slow to hear the rumours respecting Mr Arabin, which had so much disturbed the happiness of Mrs Grantly, and she also was unhappy to think that her parish clergyman should be accused of worshipping a strange goddess. She also was of opinion that rectors and vicars should all be married, and with that good-natured energy which was characteristic of her, she put her wits to work to find a fitting match for Mr Arabin. Mrs Grantly in this difficulty could think of no better remedy than a lecture from the Archdeacon. Miss Thorne thought that a young lady, marriageable and with a dowry, might be of more efficacy. In looking through the catalogue of her unmarried friends who might possibly be in want of a husband, and might also be fit for such promotion as a country parsonage affords, she could think of no one more eligible than Mrs Bold. Consequently, losing no time, she went into Barchester on the day of Mr Slope's discomfiture, the same day that her brother had had his interesting interview with the last of the Neros, and invited Mrs Bold to bring her nurse and baby to Ullathorne, and make them a protracted visit. Miss Thorne suggested a month or 2, intending to use her influence afterwards in prolonging it so as to last out the winter, in order that Mr Arabin might have an opportunity of becoming fairly intimate with his intended bride. "We'll have Mr Arabin too," said Miss Thorne to herself, "and before the spring they'll know each other, and in 12 or 18 months' time, if all goes well, Mrs Bold will be domiciled at St Ewold's." And then the kind-hearted lady gave herself some not undeserved praise for her match-making genius. Eleanor was taken a little by surprise, but the matter ended in her promising to go to Ullathorne for at any rate a week or 2. On the day previous to that on which her father drove out to Plumstead, she had had herself driven out to Ullathorne. Miss Thorne would not perplex her with her embryo lord on that same evening, thinking that she would allow her a few hours to make herself at home, But on the following morning Mr Arabin arrived.
"And now," said Miss Thorne to herself, "I must contrive to throw them in each other's way."
That same day, after dinner, Eleanor, with an assumed air of dignity which she could not maintain, with tears which she could not suppress, with a flutter which she could not conquer, and a joy which she could not hide, told Miss Thorne that she was engaged to marry Mr Arabin, and that it behoved her to get back home to Barchester as quick as she could. To say simply that Miss Thorne was rejoiced at the success of the scheme would give a very faint idea of her feelings on the occasion. My readers may probably have dreamt before now that they have had before them some terribly long walk to accomplish, some journey of 20 or 30 miles, an amount of labour frightful to anticipate, and that immediately on starting they have ingeniously found some accommodating short cut, which has brought them without fatigue to their work's end in 5 minutes. Miss Thorne's waking feelings were somewhat of the same nature. My readers may perhaps have had to do with children, and may on some occasion have promised to their young charges some great gratification intended to come off perhaps at the end of the winter, or at the beginning of summer. The impatient juveniles, however, will not wait, and clamorously demand their treat before they go to bed. Miss Thorne had a sort of feeling that her children were equally unreasonable. She was like an inexperienced gunner who has ill calculated the length of the train that he has laid. The gunpowder exploded much too soon, and poor Miss Thorne felt that she was blown up by the strength of her own petard. Miss Thorne had had lovers of her own, but they had been gentlemen of old-fashioned and deliberate habits. Miss Thorne's heart also had not always been hard, though she was still a virgin spinster, but it had never yielded in this way at the first assault. She had intended to bring together a middle-aged, studious clergyman and a discreet matron, who might possibly be induced to marry again, and in doing so she had thrown fire among tinder.
Well, it was all as it should be, but she did feel perhaps a little put out by the precipitancy of her own success, and perhaps a little vexed at the readiness of Mrs Bold to be wooed. She said, however, nothing about it to anyone, and ascribed it all to the altered manners of the new age. Their mothers and grandmothers were perhaps a little more deliberate, but it was admitted on all sides that things were conducted very differently now than in former times. For aught Miss Thorne knew of the matter, a couple of hours might be quite sufficient under the new regime to complete that for which she, in her ignorance, had allotted 12 months.
But we must not pass over the wooing so cavalierly. It has been told, with perhaps tedious accuracy, how Eleanor disposed of 2 of her lovers at Ullathorne, and it must also be told with equal accuracy, and if possible with less tedium, how she encountered Mr Arabin. It cannot be denied that when Eleanor accepted Miss Thorne's invitation, she remembered that Ullathorne was in the parish of St Ewolds. Since her interview with the Signora, she had done little else than think about Mr Arabin and the appeal that had been made to her. She could not bring herself to believe, or try to bring herself to believe, that what she had been told was untrue. Think of it how she would, she could not but accept it as a fact that Mr Arabin was fond of her, and then, when she went further and asked herself the question, she could not but accept it as a fact also that she was fond of him. If it were destined for her to be the partner of his hopes and sorrows, to whom could she look for friendship so properly as to Miss Thorne? This invitation was like an ordained step towards the fulfilment of her destiny. and when she also heard that Mr Arabin was expected to be at Ullathorne on the following day, it seemed as though all the world were conspiring in her favour. Well, did she not deserve it? In that affair of Mr Slope, had not all the world conspired against her? She could not, however, make herself easy and at home. When, in the evening after dinner, Miss Thorne expatiated on the excellence of Mr Arabin's qualities, and hinted that any little rumour which might be ill-naturedly spread abroad concerning him really meant nothing, Mrs Bold found herself unable to answer. When Miss Thorne went a little further, and declared that she did not know a prettier vicarage house in the county than St Ewald's, Mrs Bold, remembering the projected bow window and the projected priestess, still held her tongue, though her ears tingled with the conviction that all the world knew that she was in love with Mr Arabin. Well, what would that matter, if they could only meet and tell each other what each now longed to tell? And they did meet. Mr Arabin came early in the day, and found the two ladies together at work in the drawing room. Miss Thorne, who, had she known all the truth, would have vanished into air at once, had no conception that her immediate absence would be a blessing, and remained chatting with them till luncheon time. Mr Arabin could talk about nothing but the Signora Neroni's beauty, would discuss no people but the Stanhopes. This was very distressing to Eleanor, and not very satisfactory to Miss Thorne; but yet there was evidence of innocence in his open avowal of admiration. And then they had lunch, and then Mr Arabin went out on parish duty, and Eleanor and Miss Thorne were left to take a walk together. "Do you think the Signora Neroni is so lovely as people say?" Eleanor asked as they were coming home. "She is very beautiful, certainly, very beautiful," Miss Thorne answered; "but I do not know that any one considers her lovely. She is a woman all men would like to look at, but few, I imagine, would be glad to take her to their hearths, even were she unmarried and not afflicted as she is." There was some little comfort in this. Eleanor made the most of it till she got back to the house. She was then left alone in the drawing room, and just as it was getting dark, Mr Arabin came in. It was a beautiful afternoon in the beginning of October, and Eleanor was sitting in the window to get the advantage of the last daylight for her novel. There was a fire in the comfortable room, but the weather was not cold enough to make it attractive, and as she could see the sun set from where she sat, she was not very attentive to her book. Mr Arabin, when he entered, stood a while with his back to the fire in his usual way, merely uttering a few commonplace remarks about the beauty of the weather, while he plucked up courage for more interesting converse. It cannot probably be said that he had resolved then and there to make an offer to Eleanor. Men, we believe, seldom make such resolves. Mr Slope and Mr Stanhope had done so, it is true, but gentlemen generally propose without any absolutely defined determination as to their doing so. Such was now the case with Mr Arabin. "It is a lovely sunset," said Eleanor, answering him on the dreadfully trite subject which he had chosen. Mr Arabin could not see the sunset from the hearthrug, so he had to go close to her. "Very lovely," said he, standing modestly so far away from her as to avoid touching the flounces of her dress. Then it appeared that he had nothing further to say, so after gazing for a moment in silence at the brightness of the setting sun, he returned to the fire. Eleanor found that it was quite impossible for herself to commence a conversation. In the first place, she could find nothing to say. Words, which were generally plenty enough with her, would not come to her relief, and moreover do what she would, she could hardly prevent herself from crying.
"And do you like Ullathorne?"
said Mr Arabin, speaking from the safely distant position which he had assumed on the hearthrug. "Yes, indeed, very much."
"I don't mean Mr and Miss Thorne. I know you like them. But the style of the house. There is something about old-fashioned mansions, built as this is, and old-fashioned gardens, that to me is especially delightful."
"I like everything old-fashioned," said Eleanor. "Old-fashioned things are so much the honestest."
"I don't know about that," said Mr Arabin, gently laughing. "That is an opinion on which very much may be said on either side. It is strange how widely the world is divided on a subject which so nearly concerns us all, and which is so close beneath our eyes. Some think that we are quickly progressing towards perfection, while others imagine that virtue is disappearing from the earth."
"And you, Mr Arabin, what do you think?" said Eleanor. She felt somewhat surprised at the tone which his conversation was taking, and yet she was relieved at his saying something which enabled herself to speak without showing her own emotion.
"What do I think, Mrs Bold?"
And then he rumbled his money with his hands in his trousers pockets, and looked and spoke very little like a thriving lover.
"It is the bane of my life that on important subjects I acquire no fixed opinion. I think and think and go on thinking, and yet my thoughts are running ever in different directions. I hardly know whether or no we do learn more confidently than our fathers did on those high hopes to which we profess to aspire."
"I think the world grows more worldly every day," said Eleanor.
"That is because you see more of it than when you were younger. But we should hardly judge by what we see. We see so very, very little."
There was then a pause for a while, during which Mr Arabin continued to turn over his shillings and half-crowns.
"If we believe in Scripture, we can hardly think that mankind in general will now be allowed to retrograde."
Eleanor, whose mind was certainly engaged otherwise than on the general state of mankind, made no answer to this. She felt thoroughly dissatisfied with herself. She could not force her thoughts away from the topic on which the Signora had spoken to her in so strange a way, and yet she knew that she could not converse with Mr Arabin in an unrestrained natural tone till she did so. She was most anxious not to show to him any special emotion, and yet she felt that if he looked at her he would at once see that she was not at ease.
But he did not look at her. Instead of doing so, he left the fireplace and began walking up and down the room.
Eleanor took up her book resolutely, but she could not read, for there was a tear in her eye, and do what she would, it fell on her cheek. When Mr Arabin's back was turned to her, she wiped it away, but another was soon coursing down her face in its place. They would come, not a deluge of tears that would have betrayed her at once, but one by one, single monitors. Mr Arabin did not observe her closely, and they passed unseen. Mr Arabin, thus pacing up and down the room, took 4 or 5 turns before he spoke another word, and Eleanor sat equally silent, with her face bent over her book. She was afraid that her tears would get the better of her, and was preparing for an escape from the room, when Mr Arabin in his walk stood opposite to her. He did not come close up, but stood exactly on the spot to which his course brought him, and then, with his hands under his coat tails, thus made his confession.
"Mrs Bold," said he, "I owe you retribution for a great offence of which I have been guilty towards you."
Eleanor's heart beat so that she could not trust herself to say that he had never been guilty of any offence. So Mr Arabin thus went on: "I have thought much of it since, and I am now aware that I was wholly unwarranted in putting to you a question which I once asked you. It was indelicate on my part, and perhaps unmanly. No intimacy which may exist between myself and your connection, Dr Grantly, could justify it, nor could the acquaintance which existed between ourselves." This word acquaintance struck cold on Eleanor's heart. Was this to be her doom after all? "I therefore think it right to beg your pardon in a humble spirit, and I now do so." What was Eleanor to say to him? She could not say much, because she was crying, and yet she must say something. She was most anxious to say that something graciously, kindly, and yet not in such a manner as to betray herself. She had never felt herself so much at a loss for words. "Indeed, I took no offence, Mr Arabin." "Oh, but you did; and had you not done so, you would not have been yourself. You were as right to be offended as I was wrong so to offend you. I have not forgiven myself, but I hope to hear that you forgive me." She was now past speaking calmly, though she still continued to hide her tears, and Mr Arabin, after pausing a moment in vain for her reply, was walking off towards the door. She felt that she could not allow him to go unanswered without grievously sinning against all charity, so rising from her seat, she gently touched his arm and said: "Oh, Mr Arabin, do not go till I speak to you. I do forgive you. You know that I forgive you." He took the hand that had so gently touched his arm, and then gazed into her face, as if he would peruse there, as though written in a book, the whole future destiny of his life. As he did so, there was a sober, sad seriousness in his own countenance, which Eleanor found herself unable to sustain. She could only look down upon the carpet, let her tears trickle as they would, and leave her hand within his. It was but for a minute that they stood so, but the duration of that minute was sufficient to make it ever memorable to them both. Eleanor was sure now that she was loved. No words, be their eloquence what it might, could be more impressive than that eager, melancholy gaze. Why did he look so into her eyes? Why did he not speak to her? Could it be that he looked for her to make the first sign? And he, though he knew but little of women, even he knew that he was loved. He had only to ask, and it would be all his own, that inexpressible loveliness, those ever speaking but yet now mute eyes, that feminine brightness and eager, loving spirit which had so attracted him since first he had encountered it at St Ewald's. It must all be his own now. On no other supposition was it possible that she should allow her hand to remain thus clasped within his own. He had only to ask. But that was the difficulty. Did a minute suffice for all this? Nay, perhaps it might be more than a minute. "Mrs Bold," at last he said, and then stopped himself. If he could not speak, how was she to do so? He had called her by her name, the same name that any merest stranger would have used. She withdrew her hand from his, and moved as though to return to her seat. "Eleanor," he then said in his softest tone, as though the courage of a lover were as yet but half assumed, as though he were still afraid of giving offence by the freedom which he took. She looked slowly, gently, almost piteously up into his face. There was at any rate no anger there to deter him. "Eleanor!" he again exclaimed, and in a moment he had her clasped to his bosom. How this was done, whether the doing was with him or her, whether she had flown thither conquered by the tenderness of his voice, or he, with a violence not likely to give offence, had drawn her to his breast, neither of them knew, nor can I declare. There was now that sympathy between them which hardly admitted of individual motion. They were one and the same, one flesh, one spirit, one life. Eleanor, my own Eleanor, my own, my wife! She ventured to look up at him through her tears, and he, bowing his face down over hers, pressed his lips upon her brow, his virgin lips, which since a beard first grew upon his chin had never yet tasted the luxury of a woman's cheek. She had been told that her yea must be yea, or her nay, nay, but she was called on for neither the one nor the other. She told Miss Thorne that she was engaged to Mr Arabin, but no such words had passed between them, no promises had been asked or given. "Oh, let me go," said she, "let me go now. I am too happy to remain. Let me go, that I may be alone." He did not try to hinder her. He did not repeat the kiss. He did not press another on her lips. He might have done so had he been so minded. She was now all his own. He took his arm from round her waist, his arm that was trembling with a new delight, and let her go. She fled like a roe to her own chamber, and then, having turned the bolt, she enjoyed the full luxury of her love. She idolized, almost worshipped this man who had so meekly begged her pardon, and he was now her own. Oh, how she wept and cried and laughed as the hopes and fears and miseries of the last few weeks passed in remembrance through her mind. Mr Slope, that any one should have dared to think that she, who had been chosen by him, could possibly have mated herself with Mr Slope, that they should have dared to tell him also, and subject her bright happiness to such needless risk. And then she smiled with joy as she thought of all the comforts that she could give him. Not that he cared for comforts, but that it would be so delicious for her to give. She got up and rang for her maid, that she might tell her little boy of his new father, and in her own way she did tell him. She desired her maid to leave her, in order that she might be alone with her child, and then, while he lay sprawling on the bed, she poured forth the praises, all unmeaning to him, of the man she had selected to guard his infancy. She could not be happy, however, till she had made Mr Arabin take the child to himself, and thus, as it were, adopt him as his own. The moment the idea struck her, she took the baby up in her arms, and opening her door, ran quickly down to the drawing room. She at once found by his step still pacing on the floor that he was there, and a glance within the room told her that he was alone. She hesitated a moment, and then hurried in with her precious charge. Mr Arabin met her in the middle of the room. "There," said she, breathless with her haste, "there, take him, and love him." Mr Arabin took the little fellow from her, and, kissing him again and again, prayed God to bless him. "He shall be all as my own, all as my own," said he. Eleanor, as she stooped to take back her child, kissed the hand that held him, and then rushed back with her treasure to her chamber. It was thus that Mr Harding's younger daughter was won for the second time. At dinner neither she nor Mr Arabin were very bright, but their silence occasioned no remark. In the drawing room, as we have before said, she told Miss Thorne what had occurred. The next morning she returned to Barchester, and Mr Arabin went over with his budget of news to the Archdeacon. As Dr Grantly was not there, he could only satisfy himself by telling Mrs Grantly how that he intended himself the honour of becoming her brother-in-law. In the ecstasy of her joy at hearing such tidings, Mrs Grantly vouchsafed him a warmer welcome than any he had yet received from Eleanor. "Good heavens!" she exclaimed. It was the general exclamation of the rectory. "Poor Eleanor, dear Eleanor! What a monstrous injustice has been done her! Well, it shall all be made up now." And then she thought of the Signora. What lies people tell, she said to herself; but people in this matter had told no lies at all. End of chapter 48. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 49 of Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 49. The Beelzebub Colt. When Miss Thorne left the dining room, Eleanor had formed no intention of revealing to her what had occurred. But when she was seated beside her hostess on the sofa, the secret dropped from her almost unawares. Eleanor was but a bad hypocrite, and she found herself quite unable to continue talking about Mr Arabin as though he were a stranger, while her heart was full of him. When Miss Thorne, pursuing her own scheme with discreet zeal, asked the young widow whether, in her opinion, it would not be a good thing for Mr Arabin to get married, she had nothing for it but to confess the truth. "I suppose it would," said Eleanor, rather sheepishly, whereupon Miss Thorne amplified on the idea. "Oh, Miss Thorne," said Eleanor, "he is going to be married. I am engaged to him." Now Miss Thorne knew very well that there had been no such engagement when she had been walking with Mrs Bold in the morning. She had also heard enough to be tolerably sure that there had been no preliminaries to such an engagement. She was therefore, as we have before described, taken a little by surprise; but nevertheless she embraced her guest and cordially congratulated her. Eleanor had no opportunity of speaking another word to Mr Arabin that evening, except such words as all the world might hear, and these, as may be supposed, were few enough. Miss Thorne did her best to leave them in privacy, but Mr Thorne, who knew nothing of what had occurred, and another guest, a friend of his, entirely interfered with her good intentions. So poor Eleanor had to go to bed without one sign of affection. Her state, nevertheless, was not to be pitied. The next morning she was up early. It was probable, she thought, that by going down a little before the usual hour of breakfast, she might find Mr Arabin alone in the dining room. Might it not be that he also would calculate that an interview would thus be possible? Thus thinking, Eleanor was dressed a full hour before the time fixed in the Ullathorne household for morning prayers. She did not at once go down. She was afraid to seem to be too anxious to meet her lover, though heaven knows her anxiety was intense enough. She therefore sat herself down at her window, and repeatedly looking at her watch, nursed her child till she thought she might venture forth. When she found herself at the dining-room door, she stood a moment, hesitating to turn the handle; but when she heard Mr Thorne's voice inside, she hesitated no longer. Her object was defeated, and she might now go in as soon as she liked, without the slightest imputation on her delicacy. Mr Thorne and Mr Arabin were standing on the hearthrug, discussing the merits of the Beelzebub Colt, or rather, Mr Thorne was discussing, and Mr Arabin was listening. That interesting animal had rubbed the stump of his tail against the wall of his stable, and occasioned much uneasiness to the Ullathorne master of the horse. Had Eleanor but waited another minute, Mr Thorne would have been in the stables. Mr Thorne, when he saw his lady guest, repressed his anxiety. The Beelzebub Colt must do without him. And so the three stood, saying little or nothing to each other, till at last the master of the house, finding that he could no longer bear his present state of suspense respecting his favourite young steed, made an elaborate apology to Mrs Bold, and escaped. As he shut the door behind him, Eleanor almost wished that he had remained. It was not that she was afraid of Mr Arabin, but she hardly yet knew how to address him. He, however, soon relieved her from her embarrassment. He came up to her, and taking both her hands in his, he said, "So, Eleanor, you and I are to be man and wife. Is it so?" She looked up into his face, and her lips formed themselves into a single syllable. She uttered no sound, but he could read the affirmative plainly in her face. "It is a great trust," said he, "a very great trust." It is," said Eleanor, not exactly taking what he had said in the sense that he had meant. "It is a very, very great trust, and I will do my utmost to deserve it." "And I also will do my utmost to deserve it," said Mr Arabin very solemnly; and then, winding his arm round her waist, he stood there gazing at the fire, and she, with her head leaning on his shoulder, stood by him, well satisfied with her position. They neither of them spoke, or found any want of speaking. All that was needful for them to say had been said. The "yea, yea" had been spoken by Eleanor in her own way, and that way had been perfectly satisfactory to Mr Arabin. And now it remained to them each to enjoy the assurance of the other's love. And how great that luxury is! How far it surpasses any other pleasure which God has allowed to his creatures! And to a woman's heart how doubly delightful! When the ivy has found its tower, when the delicate creeper has found its strong wall, we know how the parasite plants grow and prosper. They were not created to stretch forth their branches alone, and endure without protection the summer's sun and the winter's storm. Alone they but spread themselves on the ground, and cower unseen in the dingy shade. But when they have found their firm supporters, how wonderful is their beauty, how all-pervading and victorious! What is the turret without its ivy, or the high garden wall without the jasmine which gives it its beauty and fragrance? The hedge without the honeysuckle is but a hedge. There is a feeling still half existing, but now half conquered by the force of human nature, that a woman should be ashamed of her love till the husband's right to her compels her to acknowledge it. We would fain preach a different doctrine. A woman should glory in her love, but on that account let her take the more care that it be such as to justify her glory. Eleanor did glory in hers, and she felt, and had cause to feel, that it deserved to be held as glorious. She could have stood there for hours with his arm round her, had fate and Mr Thorne permitted it. Each moment she crept nearer to his bosom, and felt more and more certain that there was her home. What now to her was the archdeacon's arrogance, her sister's coldness, or her dear father's weakness? What need she care for the duplicity of such friends as Charlotte Stanhope? She had found the strong shield that should guard her from all wrongs, the trusty pilot that should henceforward guide her through the shoals and rocks. She would give up the heavy burden of her independence, and once more assume the position of a woman and the duties of a trusting and loving wife. And he too stood there fully satisfied with his place. They were both looking intently on the fire, as though they could read there their future fate, till at last Eleanor turned her face towards his. "How sad you are!" she said, smiling. And indeed his face was, if not sad, at least serious. "How sad you are, love!"
Sad?
said he, looking down at her.
No, certainly not sad.
Her sweet loving eyes were turned towards him, and she smiled softly as he answered her. The temptation was too strong even for the demure propriety of Mr Arabin, and bending over her, he pressed his lips to hers. Immediately after this Mr Thorne appeared, and they were both delighted to hear
that the tail of the Beelzebub Colt was not materially injured. It had been Mr Harding's intention to hurry over to Ullathorne as soon as possible after his return to Barchester, in order to secure the support of his daughter in his meditated revolt against the archdeacon as touching the deanery. But he was spared the additional journey by hearing that Mrs Bold had returned unexpectedly home. As soon as he had read her note, he started off, and found her waiting for him in her own house. How much each of them had to tell the other, and how certain each was that the story which he or she had to tell would astonish the other. "My dear, I am so anxious to see you," said Mr Harding, kissing his daughter.
"Oh, papa, I have so much to tell you," said the daughter, returning the embrace.
"My dear, they have offered me the deanery," said Mr Harding, anticipating by the suddenness of the revelation the tidings which Eleanor had to give him.
"Oh, papa," said she, forgetting her own love and happiness in her joy at the surprising news. "Oh, papa, can it be possible? Dear papa, how thoroughly, thoroughly happy that makes me!"
"But, my dear, I think it best to refuse it."
"Oh, papa!"
"I am sure you will agree with me, Eleanor, when I explain it to you. You know, my dear, how old I am. If I live,
But, papa, I must tell you about myself."
"Well, my dear?"
"I do so wonder how you'll take it."
"Take what?"
"If you don't rejoice at it, if it doesn't make you happy, if you don't encourage me, I shall break my heart."
"If that be the case, Nelly, I certainly will encourage you."
"But I fear you won't. I do so fear you won't. And yet you can't but think I am the most fortunate woman living on God's earth."
"Are you, dearest? Then I certainly will rejoice with you. Come, Nelly, come to me and tell me what it is."
"I am going."
He led her to the sofa, and seating himself beside her, took both her hands in his. "You are going to be married, Nelly. Is not that it?"
"Yes,"
she said faintly.
"that is, if you will approve." And then she blushed, as she remembered the promise which she had so lately volunteered to him, and which she had so utterly forgotten in making her engagement with Mr Arabin.
Mr Harding thought for a moment who the man could be whom he was to be called upon to welcome as his son-in-law. A week since he would have had no doubt whom to name. In that case he would have been prepared to give his sanction, although he would have done so with a heavy heart. Now he knew that at any rate it would not be Mr Slope, though he was perfectly at a loss to guess who could possibly have filled the place. For a moment he thought that the man might be Bertie Stanhope, and his very soul sank within him. "Well, Nelly?"
"Oh, papa, promise to me that for my sake you will love him."
"Come, Nelly, come, tell me who it is."
"But will you love him, papa?"
"Dearest, I must love anyone that you love."
Then she turned her face to his, and whispered into his ear the name of Mr Arabin.
No man that she could have named could have more surprised or more delighted him. Had he looked round the world for a son-in-law to his taste, he could have selected no one whom he would have preferred to Mr Arabin. He was a clergyman, he held a living in the neighbourhood, he was of a set to which all Mr Harding's own partialities most closely adhered, he was the great friend of Dr Grantly, and he was, moreover, a man of whom Mr Harding knew nothing but what he approved. Nevertheless, his surprise was so great as to prevent the immediate expression of his joy. He had never thought of Mr Arabin in connection with his daughter. He had never imagined that they had any feeling in common. He had feared that his daughter had been made hostile to clergymen of Mr Arabin's stamp by her intolerance of the Archdeacon's pretensions. Had he been put to wish, he might have wished for Mr Arabin for a son-in-law; but had he been put to guess, the name would never have occurred to him. "Mr Arabin!" he exclaimed. "Impossible!"
"Oh, papa, for heaven's sake don't say anything against him. If you love me, don't say anything against him. Oh, papa, it's done, and mustn't be undone. Oh, papa!"
Fickle Eleanor! Where was the promise that she would make no choice for herself without her father's approval? She had chosen, and now demanded his acquiescence.
"Oh, papa, isn't he good? Isn't he noble? Isn't he religious, high-minded, everything that a good man possibly can be?" She clung to her father, beseeching him for his consent.
"My Nelly, my child, my own daughter, he is noble and good and high-minded. He is all that a woman can love and a man admire. He shall be my son, my own son. He shall be as close to my heart as you are. My Nelly, my child, my happy, happy child." We need not pursue the interview any further. By degrees they returned to the subject of the new promotion. Eleanor tried to prove to him, as the Grantlys had done, that his age could be no bar to his being a very excellent dean; but those arguments had now even less weight on him than before. He said little or nothing, but sat meditative. Every now and then he would kiss his daughter and say "Yes," or "No," or "Very true," or "Well, my dear, I can't quite agree with you there." But he could not be got to enter sharply into the question of to be or not to be Dean of Barchester. Of her and her happiness, of Mr Arabin and his virtues, he would talk as much as Eleanor desired, and to tell the truth, that was not a little. But about the deanery he would now say nothing further. He had got a new idea into his head. Why should not Mr Arabin be the new dean? End of chapter 49. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 50 of Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 50. The Archdeacon is satisfied with the state of affairs. The Archdeacon, in his journey into Barchester, had been assured by Mr Harding that all their prognostications about Mr Slope and Eleanor were groundless. Mr Harding, however, had found it very difficult to shake his son-in-law's faith in his own acuteness.
The matter had, to Dr Grantly, been so plainly corroborated by such patent evidence, born out of such endless circumstances, that he at first refused to take as true the positive statement which Mr Harding made to him of Eleanor's own disavowal of the impeachment. But at last he yielded. In a qualified way, he brought himself to admit that he would at the present regard his past convictions as a mistake, but in doing this he so guarded himself that if at any future time Eleanor should come forth to the world as Mrs Slope, he might still be able to say, "There, I told you so. Remember what you said, and what I said, and remember also for coming years that I was right in this matter, as in all others." He carried, however, his concession so far as to bring himself to undertake to call at Eleanor's house, and he did call accordingly, while the father and daughter were yet in the middle of their conference. Mr Harding had had so much to hear and to say that he had forgotten to advise Eleanor of the honour that awaited her, and she heard her brother-in-law's voice in the hall while she was quite unprepared to see him. "There's the Archdeacon," she said, springing up. "Yes, my dear, he told me to tell you that he would come and see you, but to tell the truth, I had forgotten all about it." Eleanor fled away, regardless of all her father's entreaties. She could not now, in the first hours of her joy, bring herself to bear all the Archdeacon's retractions, apologies, and congratulations.
He would have so much to say, and would be so tedious in saying it. Consequently, the archdeacon, when he was shown into the drawing room, found no one there but Mr Harding. "You must excuse Eleanor," said Mr Harding. "Is anything the matter?" asked the doctor,
who at once anticipated that the whole truth about Mr Slope had at last come out.
"Well, something is the matter. I wonder now whether you will be much surprised."
The archdeacon saw, by his father-in-law's manner, that after all he had nothing to tell him about Mr Slope. "No," said he, "certainly not. Nothing will ever surprise me again."
Very many men nowadays, besides the archdeacon, adopt or affect to adopt the nil admirari doctrine, but nevertheless, to judge from their appearance, they are just as subject to sudden emotions as their grandfathers and grandmothers were before them.
"What do you think Mr Arabin has done?"
"Mr Arabin? It's nothing about that daughter of Stanhope's, I hope?"
"No, not that woman," said Mr Harding, enjoying his joke in his sleeve.
"Not that woman? Is he going to do anything about any woman? Why can't you speak out if you have anything to say? There is nothing I hate so much as these sort of mysteries."
"There shall be no mystery with you, Archdeacon, though of course it must go no further at present."
"Well,
except Susan. You must promise me you'll tell no one else."
"Nonsense!"
exclaimed the archdeacon, who was becoming angry in his suspense.
"You can't have any secret about Mr Arabin."
"Only this, that he and Eleanor are engaged."
It was quite clear to see by the archdeacon's face that he did not believe a word of it.
"Mr Arabin? It's impossible."
"Eleanor, at any rate, has just now told me so."
"It's impossible,"
repeated the archdeacon.
"Well, I can't say I think it impossible. It certainly took me by surprise, but that does not make it impossible."
"She must be mistaken."
Mr Harding assured him that there was no mistake, that he would find on returning home that Mr Arabin had been to Plumstead with the express object of making the same declaration, that even Miss Thorne knew all about it, and that in fact the thing was as clearly settled as any such arrangement between a lady and a gentleman could well be.
"Good heavens!"
said the archdeacon, walking up and down Eleanor's drawing room.
"Good heavens! Good heavens!"
Now these exclamations certainly betokened faith.
Mr Harding properly gathered from it that at last Dr Grantly did believe the fact. The first utterance clearly evinced a certain amount of distaste at the information he had received. The second simply indicated surprise. In the tone of the third, Mr Harding fancied that he could catch a certain gleam of satisfaction. The archdeacon had truly expressed the workings of his mind.
He could not but be disgusted to find how utterly astray he had been in all his anticipations, Had he only been lucky enough to have suggested this marriage himself, when he first brought Mr Arabin into the country, his character for judgment and wisdom would have received an addition which would have classed him, at any rate, next to Solomon. And why had he not done so? Might he not have foreseen that Mr Arabin would want a wife in his parsonage? He had foreseen that Eleanor would want a husband, but should he not also have perceived that Mr Arabin was a man much more likely to attract her than Mr Slope?
The Archdeacon found that he had been at fault, and of course could not immediately get over his discomfiture. Then his surprise was intense.
How sly this pair of young turtle-doves had been with him! How egregiously they had hoaxed him! He had preached to Eleanor against her fancied attachment to Mr Slope at the very time that she was in love with his own protégé, Mr Arabin, and had absolutely taken that same Mr Arabin into his confidence with reference to his dread of Mr Slope's alliance.
It was very natural that the Archdeacon should feel surprise.
But there was also great ground for satisfaction. Looking at the match by itself, it was the very thing to help the doctor out of his difficulties. In the first place, the assurance that he should never have Mr Slope for his brother-in-law was in itself a great comfort. Then Mr Arabin was, of all men, the one with whom it would best suit him to be so intimately connected. But the crowning comfort was the blow which this marriage would give to Mr Slope. He had now certainly lost his wife. Rumour was beginning to whisper that he might possibly lose his position in the palace, and if Mr Harding would only be true, the great danger of all would be surmounted. In such case it might be expected that Mr Slope would own himself vanquished, and take himself altogether away from Barchester, and so the Archdeacon would again be able to breathe pure air. "Well, well," said he. "Good heavens! Good heavens!"
And the tone of the fifth exclamation made Mr Harding fully aware that content was reigning in the Archdeacon's bosom. And then, slowly, gradually, and craftily, Mr Harding propounded his own new scheme. Why should not Mr Arabin be the new dean?
Slowly, gradually, and thoughtfully, Dr Grantly fell into his father-in-law's views. Much as he liked Mr Arabin, sincere as was his admiration for that gentleman's ecclesiastical abilities, he would not have sanctioned a measure which would rob his father-in-law of his fairly earned promotion, were it at all practicable to induce his father-in-law to accept the promotion which he had earned. But the Archdeacon had, on a former occasion, received proof of the obstinacy with which Mr Harding could adhere to his own views, in opposition to the advice of all his friends. He knew tolerably well that nothing would induce the meek mild man before him to take the high place offered to him if he thought it wrong to do so. Knowing this, he also said to himself more than once, why should not Mr Arabin be Dean of Barchester? It was at last arranged between them that they would together start to London by the earliest train on the following morning, making a little detour to Oxford on their journey. Dr Gwynne's counsels, they imagined, might perhaps be of assistance to them. These matters settled, the archdeacon hurried off that he might return to Plumstead and prepare for his journey. The day was extremely fine, and he came into the city in an open gig. As he was driving up the High Street, he encountered Mr Slope at a crossing. Had he not pulled up rather sharply, he would have run over him. The two had never spoken to each other since they had met on a memorable occasion in the bishop's study. They did not speak now, but they looked each other full in the face, and Mr Slope's countenance was as impudent, as triumphant, as defiant as ever. Had Dr Grantly not known to the contrary, he would have imagined that his enemy had won the deanship, the wife, and all the rich honours for which he had been striving. As it was, he had lost everything that he had in the world, and had just received his congé from the bishop. In leaving the town, the archdeacon drove by the well-remembered entrance of Hiram's Hospital. There at the gate was a large, untidy farmer's waggon, laden with untidy-looking furniture, and there, inspecting the arrival, was good Mrs Quiverful, not dressed in her Sunday best, not very clean in her apparel, not graceful as to her bonnet and shawl, or indeed with many feminine charms as to her whole appearance. She was busy at domestic work in her new house, and had just ventured out, expecting to see no one on the arrival of the family chattels. The archdeacon was down upon her before she knew where she was. Her acquaintance with Dr Grantly or his family was very slight indeed. The archdeacon, as a matter of course, knew every clergyman in the archdeaconry, it may almost be said in the diocese, and had some acquaintance, more or less intimate, with their wives and families. With Mr Quiverful he had been concerned on various matters of business, but of Mrs Q he had seen very little. Now, however, he was in too gracious a mood to pass her by unnoticed.
The Quiverfuls, one and all, had looked for the bitterest hostility from Dr Grantly. They knew his anxiety that Mr Harding should return to his old home at the hospital, and they did not know that a new home had been offered to him at the Deanery. Mrs Quiverful was therefore not a little surprised, and not a little rejoiced also at the tone in which she was addressed.
"How do you do, Mrs Quiverful? How do you do?"
said he, stretching his left hand out of the gig as he spoke to her.
"I am very glad to see you employed in so pleasant and useful a manner. Very glad indeed."
Mrs Quiverful thanked him, and shook hands with him, and looked into his face suspiciously. She was not sure whether the congratulations and kindness were or were not ironical.
"Pray tell Mr Quiverful from me," he continued, "that I am rejoiced at his appointment. It's a comfortable place, Mrs Quiverful, and a comfortable house, and I am very glad to see you in it. Good-bye, good-bye."
And he drove on, leaving the lady well pleased and astonished at his good nature.
On the whole, things were going well with the archdeacon, and he could afford to be charitable to Mrs Quiverful. He looked forth from his gig smilingly on all the world, and forgave everyone in Barchester their sins. excepting only Mrs Proudie and Mr Slope. Had he seen the bishop, he would have felt inclined to pat even him kindly on the head. He determined to go home by St Ewold's. This would take him some 3 miles out of his way, but he felt that he could not leave Plumstead comfortably without saying one word of good fellowship to Mr Arabin. When he reached the parsonage, the vicar was still out, but from what he had heard he did not doubt but that he would meet him on the road between their 2 houses. He was right in this, for about half-way home, at a narrow turn, he came upon Mr Arabin, who was on horseback.
"Well, well, well, well," said the Archdeacon, loudly, joyously, and with supreme good humour. "Well, well, well, well! So after all we have no further cause to fear Mr Slope." "I hear from Mrs Grantly that they have offered the Deanery to Mr Harding," said the other.
"Mr Slope has lost more than the Deanery, I find."
And then the Archdeacon laughed jocosely.
"Come, come, Arabin, you have kept your secret well enough. I know all about it now."
"I have had no secret, Archdeacon," said the other with a quiet smile. "None at all, not for a day. It was only yesterday that I knew my own good fortune, and today I went over to Plumstead to ask your approval. From what Mrs Grantly has said to me, I am led to hope that I shall have it."
"With all my heart, with all my heart,"
said the Archdeacon cordially, holding his friend fast by the hand.
"It's just as I would have it. She is an excellent young woman. She will not come to you empty-handed, and I think she will make you a good wife. If she does her duty by you as her sister does by me, you'll be a happy man, that's all I can say."
And as he finished speaking, a tear might have been observed in each of the doctor's eyes. Mr Arabin warmly returned the Archdeacon's grasp, but he said little. His heart was too full for speaking, and he could not express the gratitude which he felt.
Dr Grantly understood him as well as though he had spoken for an hour. "And mind, Arabin," said he, "no one but myself shall tie the knot. We'll get Eleanor out to Plumstead, and it shall come off there. I'll make Susan stir herself, and we'll do it in style. I must be off to London tomorrow on special business. Harding goes with me, but I'll be back before your bride has got her wedding dress ready."
And so they parted.
On his journey home, the Archdeacon occupied his mind with preparations for the marriage festivities. He made a great resolve that he would atone to Eleanor for all the injury he had done her by the munificence of his future treatment. He would show her what was the difference in his eyes between a Slope and an Arabin. On one other thing also he decided, with a firm mind. If the affair of the Dean should not be settled in Mr Arabin's favour, nothing should prevent him putting a new front and bow window to the dining room at St Ewold's parsonage. "So we're sold after all, Sue," said he to his wife, accosting her with a kiss as soon as he entered his house. He did not call his wife Sue above twice or thrice in a year, and these occasions were great high days.
"Eleanor has had more sense than we gave her credit for," said Mrs Grantly. And there was great content in Plumstead Rectory that evening. Mrs Grantly promised her husband that she would now open her heart and take Mr Arabin into it. Hitherto she had declined to do so. End of chapter 50. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 51 of Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 51. Mr Slope bids farewell to the palace and its inhabitants. We must now take leave of Mr Slope, and of the bishop also, and of Mrs Proudie. These leave-takings in novels are as disagreeable as they are in real life. Not so sad indeed, for they want the reality of sadness, but quite as perplexing and generally less satisfactory. What novelist, what Fielding, what Scott, what George Sand, or Sue, or Dumas can impart an interest to the last chapter of his fictitious history? Promises of 2 children and superhuman happiness are of no avail, nor assurance of extreme respectability carried to an age far exceeding that usually allotted to mortals. The sorrows of our heroes and heroines, they are your delight, O public. Their sorrows, or their sins, or their absurdities, not their virtues, good sense, and consequent rewards. When we begin to tint our final pages with couleur de rose, as in accordance with fixed rule we must do, we altogether extinguish our own powers of pleasing. When we become dull, we offend your intellect, and we must become dull, or we should offend your taste. A late writer, wishing to sustain his interest to the last page, hung his hero at the end of the 3rd volume. The consequence was that no one would read his novel. And who can apportion out and dovetail his incidents, dialogues, characters, and descriptive morsels so as to fit them all exactly into 930 pages, without either compressing them unnaturally or extending them artificially at the end of his labour? Do I not myself know that I am at this moment in want of a dozen pages, and that I am sick with cudgelling my brains to find them? And then, when everything is done, the kindest-hearted critic of them all invariably twits us with the incompetency and lameness of our conclusion. We have either become idle and neglected it, or tedious and overlaboured it. It is insipid or unnatural, overstrained or imbecile. It means nothing, or attempts too much. The last scene of all, as all last scenes we fear must be, is second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. I can only say that if some critic who thoroughly knows his work, and has laboured on it till experience has made him perfect, will write the last 50 pages of a novel in the way they should be written, I, for one, will in future do my best to copy the example. Guided by my own lights only, I confess that I despair of success. For the last week or 10 days, Mr Slope had seen nothing of Mrs Proudie, and very little of the bishop. He still lived in the palace, and still went through his usual routine work, but the confidential doings of the diocese had passed into other hands. He had seen this clearly and marked it well, but it had not much disturbed him. He had indulged in other hopes, till the bishop's affairs had become dull to him, and he was moreover aware that, as regarded the diocese, Mrs Proudie had checkmated him. It has been explained in the beginning of these pages how 3 or 4 were contending together as to who, in fact, should be Bishop of Barchester. Each of these had now admitted to himself, or boasted to herself, that Mrs Proudie was victorious in the struggle. They had gone through a competitive examination of considerable severity, and she had come forth the winner, facile princeps. Mr Slope had for a moment run her hard, but it was only for a moment. It had become, as it were, acknowledged that Hiram's Hospital should be the testing point between them, and now Mr Quiverful was already in the hospital, the proof of Mrs Proudie's skill and courage. All this did not break down Mr Slope's spirit, because he had other hopes. But alas, at last there came to him a note from his friend Sir Nicholas, informing him that the deanship was disposed of. Let us give Mr Slope his due. He did not lie prostrate under this blow, or give himself up to vain lamentations. He did not henceforward despair of life, and call upon gods above and gods below to carry him off. He sat himself down in his chair, counted out what moneys he had in hand for present purposes, and what others were coming in to him, bethought himself as to the best sphere for his future exertions, and at once wrote off a letter to a rich sugar refiner's wife in Baker Street, who, as he well knew, was much given to the entertainment and encouragement of serious young evangelical clergymen. He was again, he said, upon the world, having found the air of a cathedral town, and the very nature of cathedral services uncongenial to his spirit. And then he sat a while, making firm resolves as to his manner of parting from the bishop, and also as to his future conduct. At last he rose, and twitched his mantle black, tomorrow to fresh woods and pastures new. Having received a formal command to wait upon the bishop, he rose and proceeded to obey it. He rang the bell and desired the servant to inform his master that, if it suited his lordship, he, Mr Slope, was ready to wait upon him. The servant, who well understood that Mr Slope was no longer in the ascendant, brought back a message saying that his lordship desired that Mr Slope would attend him immediately in his study. Mr Slope waited about 10 minutes more to prove his independence, and then he went into the bishop's room. There, as he had expected, he found Mrs Proudie together with her husband.
Mr Slope, pray take a chair," said the gentleman bishop.
"Pray be seated, Mr Slope," said the lady bishop.
Thank ye, said Mr Slope, and walking round to the fire, he threw himself into one of the armchairs that graced the hearthrug.
"Mr Slope," said the bishop, "it has become necessary that I should speak to you definitively on a matter that has for some time been pressing itself on my attention."
"May I ask whether the subject is in any way connected with myself?" said Mr Slope.
"It is so, certainly. Yes, it certainly is connected with yourself, Mr Slope."
"Then, my lord, if I may be allowed to express a wish, I would prefer that no discussion on the subject should take place between us in the presence of a third person."
"Don't alarm yourself, Mr Slope," said Mrs Proudie. "No discussion is at all necessary. The bishop merely intends to express his own wishes." I merely intend, Mr Slope, to express my own wishes. No discussion will be at all necessary," said the bishop, reiterating his wife's words. "That is more, my lord, than we any of us can be sure of," said Mr Slope. "I cannot, however, force Mrs Proudie to leave the room, nor can I refuse to remain here if it be your lordship's wish that I should do so."
"It is his lordship's wish, certainly," said Mrs Proudie.
"Mr Slope," began the bishop in a solemn, serious voice, "it grieves me to have to find fault. It grieves me much to have to find fault with a clergyman, but especially so with a clergyman in your position."
"Why, what have I done amiss, my lord?" demanded Mr Slope boldly.
"What have you done amiss, Mr Slope?" said Mrs Proudie, standing erect before the culprit, and raising that terrible forefinger. "Do you dare to ask the bishop what you have done amiss? Does not your conscience—"
"Mrs Proudie, pray let it be understood once for all that I will have no words with you."
"Ah, sir, but you will have words," said she. "You must have words. Why have you had so many words with that Signora Neroni? Why have you disgraced yourself, you, a clergyman too, by constantly consorting with such a woman as that, with a married woman, with one altogether unfit for a clergyman's society?"
"At any rate, I was introduced to her in your drawing room," retorted Mr Slope.
"And shamefully you behaved there," said Mrs Proudie. "Most shamefully. I was wrong to allow you to remain in the house a day after what I then saw. I should have insisted on your instant dismissal."
"I have yet to learn, Mrs Proudie, that you have the power to insist either on my going from hence or on my staying here."
"What!" said the lady. "I am not to have the privilege of saying who shall and who shall not frequent my own drawing room? I am not to save my servants and dependents from having their morals corrupted by improper conduct? I am not to save my own daughters from impurity? I will let you see, Mr Slope, whether I have the power or whether I have not. You will have the goodness to understand that you no longer fill any situation about the bishop; and as your room will be immediately wanted in the palace for another chaplain, I must ask you to provide yourself with apartments as soon as may be convenient to you."
"My lord," said Mr Slope, appealing to the bishop, and so turning his back completely on the lady, "will you permit me to ask that I may have from your own lips any decision that you may have come to on this matter?"
"Certainly, Mr Slope, certainly," said the bishop. "That is but reasonable. Well, my decision is that you had better look for some other preferment. For the situation which you have lately held, I do not think that you are well suited."
"And what, my lord, has been my fault?"
"That Signora Neroni is one fault," said Mrs Proudie, "and a very abominable fault she is; very abominable and very disgraceful. Fie, Mr Slope, fie! You an evangelical clergyman indeed!"
"My lord, I desire to know for what fault I am turned out of your lordship's house."
"You hear what Mrs Proudie says," said the bishop.
"When I publish the history of this transaction, my lord, as I decidedly shall do in my own vindication, I presume you will not wish me to state that you have discarded me at your wife's bidding." because she has objected to my being acquainted with another lady, the daughter of one of the prebendaries of the chapter."
"You may publish what you please, sir," said Mrs Proudie, "but you will not be insane enough to publish any of your doings in Barchester. Do you think I have not heard of your kneelings at that creature's feet, that is, if she has any feet, and of your constant slobbering over her hand? I advise you to beware, Mr Slope, of what you do and say. Clergymen have been unfrocked for less than what you have been guilty of."
"My lord, if this goes on, I shall be obliged to indict this woman, Mrs Proudie, I mean, for defamation of character."
"I think, Mr Slope, you had better now retire," said the bishop. "I will enclose to you a cheque for any balance that may be due to you. Under the present circumstances, it will of course be better for all parties that you should leave the palace at the earliest possible moment. I will allow you for your journey back to London, and for your maintenance in Barchester for a week from this date."
"If, however, you wish to remain in this neighbourhood," said Mrs Proudie, "and will solemnly pledge yourself never again to see that woman, and will promise also to be more circumspect in your conduct, the bishop will mention your name to Mr Quiverful, who now wants a curate at Puddingdale. The house is, I imagine, quite sufficient for your requirements, and there will, moreover, be a stipend of £50 a year."
"May God forgive you, madam, for the manner in which you have treated me," said Mr Slope, looking at her with a very heavenly look. "And remember this, madam, that you yourself may still have a fall," and he looked at her with a very worldly look. "As to the bishop, I pity him." And so saying, Mr Slope left the room. Thus ended the intimacy of the Bishop of Barchester with his first confidential chaplain. Mrs Proudie was right in this, namely, that Mr Slope was not insane enough to publish to the world any of his doings in Barchester. He did not trouble his friend Mr Towers with any written statement of the iniquity of Mrs Proudie, or the imbecility of her husband. He was aware that it would be wise in him to drop for the future all allusion to his doings in the cathedral city. Soon after the interview just recorded, he left Barchester, shaking the dust off his feet as he entered the railway carriage, and he gave no longing, lingering look after the cathedral towers as the train hurried him quickly out of their sight. It is well known that the family of the Slopes never starve. They always fall on their feet like cats, and let them fall where they will, they live on the fat of the land. Our Mr Slope did so. On his return to town he found that the sugar refiner had died, and that his widow was inconsolable, in other words, in want of consolation. Mr Slope consoled her, and soon found himself settled with much comfort in the house in Baker Street. He possessed himself also before long of a church in the vicinity of the Red Road, and became known to fame as one of the most eloquent preachers and pious clergymen in that part of the metropolis. There let us leave him. Of the bishop and his wife very little further need be said. From that time forth nothing material occurred to interrupt the even course of their domestic harmony. Very speedily a further vacancy on the bench of bishops gave to Dr Proudie the seat in the House of Lords which he at first so anxiously longed for. But by this time he had become a wiser man. He did certainly take his seat, and occasionally registered a vote in favour of government views on ecclesiastical matters. But he had thoroughly learnt that his proper sphere of action
lay in close contiguity with Mrs Proudie's wardrobe. He never again aspired to disobey, or seemed even to wish for autocratic diocesan authority. If ever he thought of freedom, he did so as men think of the millennium, as of a good time which may be coming, but which nobody expects to come in their day. Mrs Proudie might be said still to bloom, and was at any rate strong, and the bishop had no reason to apprehend that he would be speedily visited with the sorrows of a widower's life. He is still Bishop of Barchester. He has so graced that throne that the government has been averse to translate him even to higher dignities. There may he remain under safe pupilage, till the new-fangled manners of the age have discovered him to be superannuated, and bestowed on him a pension. As for Mrs Proudie, our prayers for her are that she may live for ever. End of chapter 51. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 52 of Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 52. The new dean takes possession of the deanery, and the new warden of the hospital. Mr Harding and the Archdeacon together made their way to Oxford, and there, by dint of cunning argument, they induced the Master of Lazarus also to ask himself this momentous question:
Why should not Mr Arabin be Dean of Barchester? He, of course, for a while tried his hand at persuading Mr Harding that he was foolish, over-scrupulous, self-willed, and weak-minded. But he tried in vain. If Mr Harding would not give way to Dr Grantly, it was not likely that he would give way to Dr Gwynne, more especially now that so admirable a scheme as that of inducting Mr Arabin into the deanery had been set on foot. When the master found that his eloquence was vain, and heard also that Mr Arabin was about to become Mr Harding's son-in-law, he confessed that he also would, under such circumstances, be glad to see his old friend and protégé, the fellow of his college, placed in the comfortable position that was going a-begging. "It might be the means, you know, master, of keeping Mr Slope out," said the Archdeacon, with grave caution. "He has no more chance of it," said the master, "than our college chaplain. I know more about it than that." Mrs Grantly had been right in her surmise. It was the Master of Lazarus who had been instrumental in representing in high places the claims which Mr Harding had upon the government, and he now consented to use his best endeavours towards getting the offer transferred to Mr Arabin. The three of them went on to London together, and there they remained a week, to the great disgust of Mrs Grantly, and most probably also of Mrs Gwynne. The minister was out of town in one direction, and his private secretary in another. The clerks who remained could do nothing in such a matter as this, and all was difficulty and confusion. The two doctors seemed to have plenty to do. They bustled here and they bustled there, and complained at their club in the evenings that they had been driven off their legs. But Mr Harding had no occupation. Once or twice he suggested that he might perhaps return to Barchester. His request, however, was peremptorily refused, and he had nothing for it but to while away his time in Westminster Abbey. At length an answer from the great man came. The Master of Lazarus had made his proposition through the Bishop of Belgravia. Now this bishop, though but newly gifted with his diocesan honours, was a man of much weight in the clerico-political world. He was,
if not as pious, at any rate as wise as St Paul, and had been with so much effect all things to all men, that though he was great among the dons of Oxford, he had been selected for the most favourite seat on the bench by a Whig prime minister. To him Dr Gwynne had made known his wishes and his arguments, and the bishop had made them known to the Marquis of Kensington Gore. The Marquis, who was Lord High Steward of the Pantry Board, and who by most men was supposed to hold the highest office out of the cabinet, trafficked much in affairs of this kind. He not only suggested the arrangement to the minister over a cup of coffee, standing on a drawing-room rug in Windsor Castle, but he also favourably mentioned Mr Arabin's name in the ear of a distinguished person. And so the matter was arranged. The answer of the great man came, and Mr Arabin was made Dean of Barchester. The 3 clergymen who had come up to town on this important mission dined together with great glee on the day on which the news reached them. In a silent, decent, clerical manner, they toasted Mr Arabin with full bumpers of claret. The satisfaction of all of them was supreme. The master of Lazarus had been successful in his attempt, and success is dear to us all.
The Archdeacon had trampled upon Mr Slope, and had lifted to high honours the young clergyman whom he had induced to quit the retirement and comfort of the university.
So at least the Archdeacon thought, though to speak sooth, not he, but circumstances had trampled on Mr Slope.
But the satisfaction of Mr Harding was of all perhaps the most complete. He laid aside his usual melancholy manner, and brought forth little quiet jokes from the inmost mirth of his heart. He poked his fun at the Archdeacon about Mr Slope's marriage, and quizzed him for his improper love for Mrs Proudie.
On the following day they all returned to Barchester. It was arranged that Mr Arabin should know nothing of what had been done till he received the minister's letter from the hands of his embryo father-in-law. In order that no time might be lost, a message had been sent to him by the preceding night's post, begging him to be at the Deanery at the hour that the train from London arrived. There was nothing in this which surprised Mr Arabin. It had somehow got about through all Barchester that Mr Harding was the new dean, and all Barchester was prepared to welcome him with pealing bells and full hearts. Mr Slope had certainly had a party. There had certainly been those in Barchester who were prepared to congratulate him on his promotion with assumed sincerity. But even his own party was not broken-hearted by his failure. The inhabitants of the city, even the high-souled, ecstatic young ladies of 35, had begun to comprehend that their welfare, and the welfare of the place, was connected in some mysterious manner with daily chants and bi-weekly anthems. The expenditure of the palace had not added much to the popularity of the bishop's side of the question, and on the whole there was a strong reaction. When it became known to all the world that Mr Harding was to be the new dean, all the world rejoiced heartily. Mr Arabin, we have said, was not surprised at the summons which called him to the deanery. He had not as yet seen Mr Harding since Eleanor had accepted him, nor had he seen him since he had learnt his future father-in-law's preferment. There was nothing more natural, more necessary, than that they should meet each other at the earliest possible moment. Mr Arabin was waiting in the deanery parlour when Mr Harding and Dr Grantly were driven up from the station. There was some excitement in the bosoms of them all as they met and shook hands, by far too much to enable either of them to begin his story and tell it in a proper equable style of narrative.
Mr Harding was some minutes quite dumbfounded, and Mr Arabin could only talk in short, spasmodic sentences about his love and good fortune. He slipped in as best he could some sort of congratulation about the deanship, and then went on with his hopes and fears: hopes that he might be received as a son, and fears that he hardly deserved such good fortune. Then he went back to the dean. It was the most thoroughly satisfactory appointment, he said, of which he had ever heard. But, said Mr Harding, and then, failing to get any further, he looked imploringly at the Archdeacon.
The truth is, Arabin, said the doctor, that after all you are not destined to be son-in-law to a dean, nor am I either, more's the pity.
Mr Arabin looked at him for explanation. Is not Mr Harding to be the new dean?
It appears not,
said the Archdeacon. Mr Arabin's face fell a little, and he looked from one to the other. It was plainly to be seen from them both that there was no cause of unhappiness in the matter, at least not of unhappiness to them, but there was as yet no elucidation of the mystery.
Think how old I am,
said Mr Harding imploringly.
Fiddlestick,
said the Archdeacon.
That's all very well, but it won't make a young man of me, said Mr Harding.
And who is to be dean? asked Mr Arabin.
Yes, that's the question,
said the Archdeacon.
Come, Mr Precentor, since you obstinately refuse to be anything else, let us know who is to be the man. He has got the nomination in his pocket.
With his eyes brimful of tears, Mr Harding pulled out the letter and handed it to his future son-in-law. He tried to make a little speech, but failed altogether. Having given up the document, he turned round to the wall, feigning to blow his nose, and then sat himself down on the old dean's dingy horsehair sofa. And here we find it necessary to bring our account of the interview to an end. Nor can we pretend to describe the rapture with which Mr Harding was received by his daughter. She wept with grief, and wept with joy, with grief that her father should, in his old age, still be without that rank and worldly position which, according to her ideas, he had so well earned, and with joy in that he, her darling father, should have bestowed on that other dear one the good things of which he himself would not open his hand to take possession. And here Mr Harding again showed his weakness. In the melee of this exposal of their loves and reciprocal affection, he found himself unable to resist the entreaties of all parties that the lodgings in the High Street should be given up. Eleanor would not live in the Deanery, she said, unless her father lived there also.
Mr Arabin would not be dean, unless Mr Harding would be co-dean with him. The Archdeacon declared that his father-in-law should not have his own way in everything,
and Mrs Grantly carried him off to Plumstead, that he might remain there till Mr and Mrs Arabin were in a state to receive him in their own mansion.
Pressed by such arguments as these, what could a weak old man do but yield? But there was yet another task which it behoved Mr Harding to do before he could allow himself to be at rest. Little has been said in these pages of the state of those remaining old men who had lived under his sway at the hospital, but not on this account must it be presumed that he had forgotten them, or that in their state of anarchy and in their want of due government he had omitted to visit them.
He visited them constantly, and had latterly given them to understand that they would soon be required to subscribe their adherents to a new master. There were now but 5 of them, one of them having been but quite lately carried to his rest. But 5 of the full number, which had hitherto been 12, and which was now to be raised to 24, including women. Of these, old Bunce, who for many years had been the favourite of the late warden, was one, and Abel Handy, who had been the humble means of driving that warden from his home, was another. Mr Harding now resolved that he himself would introduce the new warden to the hospital. He felt that many circumstances might conspire to make the men receive Mr Quiverful with aversion and disrespect. He felt also that Mr Quiverful might himself feel some qualms of conscience if he entered the hospital with an idea that he did so in hostility to his predecessor. Mr Harding therefore determined to walk in arm with Mr Quiverful, and to ask from these men their respectful obedience to their new master. On returning to Barchester, he found that Mr Quiverful had not yet slept in the hospital house or entered on his new duties. He accordingly made known to that gentleman his wishes, and his proposition was not rejected. It was a bright clear morning, though in November, that Mr Harding and Mr Quiverful, arm in arm, walked through the hospital gate. It was one trait in our old friend's character that he did nothing with parade. He omitted, even in the more important doings of his life, that sort of parade by which most of us deem it necessary to grace our important doings. We have housewarmings, christenings, and gala days. We keep, if not our own birthdays, those of our children. We are apt to fuss ourselves if called upon to change our residences, and have almost all of us our little state occasions. Mr Harding had no state occasions. When he left his old house, he went forth from it with the same quiet composure as though he were merely taking his daily walk. Now that he re-entered it with another warden under his wing, he did so with the same quiet step and calm demeanour. He was a little less upright than he had been 5 years, nay, it was now nearly 6 years ago. He walked perhaps a little slower. His footfall was perhaps a thought less firm. Otherwise, one might have said that he was merely returning with a friend under his arm. This friendliness was everything to Mr Quiverful. To him, even in his poverty, the thought that he was supplanting a brother clergyman so kind and courteous as Mr Harding had been very bitter. Under his circumstances it had been impossible for him to refuse the proffered boon. He could not reject the bread that was offered to his children, or refuse to ease the heavy burden that had so long oppressed that poor wife of his. Nevertheless, it had been very grievous to him to think that in going to the hospital he might encounter the ill will of his brethren in the diocese. All this Mr Harding had fully comprehended. It was for such feelings as these, for the nice comprehension of such motives, that his heart and intellect were peculiarly fitted. In most matters of worldly import the archdeacon set down his father-in-law as little better than a fool, and perhaps he was right. But in some other matters, equally important if they be rightly judged, Mr Harding, had he been so minded, might with as much propriety have set down his son-in-law for a fool. Few men, however, are constituted as was Mr Harding. He had that nice appreciation of the feelings of others which belongs of right exclusively to women. Arm in arm they walked into the inner quadrangle of the building, and there the 5 old men met them. Mr Harding shook hands with them all, and then Mr Quiverful did the same. With Bunce, Mr Harding shook hands twice, and Mr Quiverful was about to repeat the same ceremony, but the old man gave him no encouragement.
"I am very glad to know that at last you have a new warden," said Mr Harding in a very cheery voice.
"We be very old for any change," said one of them, "but we do suppose it be all for the best." "Certainly it is for the best," said Mr Harding. "You will again have a clergyman of your own church under the same roof with you, and a very excellent clergyman you will have. It is a great satisfaction to me to know that so good a man is coming to take care of you, and that it is no stranger, but a friend of my own, who will allow me from time to time to come in and see you." "We be very thankful to your reverence," said another of them. "I need not tell you, my good friends," said Mr Quiverful, "how extremely grateful I am to Mr Harding for his kindness to me. I must say his uncalled for, unexpected kindness." "He be always very kind," said a third.
"What I can do to fill the void which he left here, I will do. For your sake and my own, I will do so, and especially for his sake. But to you who have known him, I can never be the same well-loved friend and father that he has been."
"No, sir, no,"
said old Bunce, who hitherto had held his peace.
"No one can be that, not if the new bishop sent a hangel to us out of heaven. We doesn't doubt you'll do your best, sir, but you'll not be like the old master, not to us old ones." "Fie, Bunce, fie! How dare you talk in that way?" said Mr Harding; but as he scolded the old man, he still held him by his arm and pressed it with warm affection.
There was no getting up any enthusiasm in the matter. How could 5 old men, tottering away to their final resting place, be enthusiastic on the reception of a stranger? What could Mr Quiverful be to them, or they to Mr Quiverful? Had Mr Harding indeed come back to them, some last flicker of joyous light might have shone forth on their aged cheeks, but it was in vain to bid them rejoice because Mr Quiverful was about to move his 14 children from Puddingdale into the hospital house. In reality they did no doubt receive advantage, spiritual as well as corporal, but this they could neither anticipate nor acknowledge. It was a dull affair enough, this introduction of Mr Quiverful, but still it had its effect. The good which Mr Harding intended did not fall to the ground. All the Barchester world, including the 5 old bedesmen, treated Mr Quiverful with the more respect because Mr Harding had thus walked in arm with him on his first entrance to his duties. And here, in their new abode, we will leave Mr and Mrs Quiverful and their 14 children. May they enjoy the good things which Providence has at length given to them. End of chapter 52. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 53 of Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 53. Conclusion. The end of a novel, like the end of a children's dinner party, must be made up of sweetmeats and sugar plums. There is now nothing else to be told but the gala doings of Mr Arabin's marriage; nothing more to be described than the wedding dresses; no further dialogue to be recorded than that which took place between the Archdeacon, who married them, and Mr Arabin and Eleanor, who were married.
"Wilt thou have this woman to be thy wedded wife?"
And
"Wilt thou have this man to be thy wedded husband, to live together according to God's ordinance?"
Mr Arabin and Eleanor each answered, "I will." We have no doubt that they will keep their promises, the more especially as the Signora Neroni had left Barchester before the ceremony was performed. Mrs Bold had been somewhat more than 2 years a widow before she was married to her second husband, and little Johnny was then able, with due assistance, to walk on his own legs into the drawing room to receive the salutations of the assembled guests. Mr Harding gave away the bride, the Archdeacon performed the service, and the 2 Miss Grantlys, who were joined in their labours by other young ladies of the neighbourhood, performed the duties of bridesmaids with equal diligence and grace. Mrs Grantly superintended the breakfast, and Mary Bold distributed the cards and cake. The Archdeacon's 3 sons had also come home for the occasion. The elder was great with learning, being regarded by all who knew him as a certain future double first. The second, however, bore the palm on this occasion, being resplendent in a new uniform. The third was just entering the university, and was probably the proudest of the 3. But the most remarkable feature in the whole occasion was the excessive liberality of the Archdeacon. He literally made presents to everybody. As Mr Arabin had already moved out of the parsonage of St Ewold's, that scheme of elongating the dining room was of course abandoned, but he would have refurnished the whole deanery had he been allowed. He sent down a magnificent piano by Erard, gave Mr Arabin a cob which any dean in the land might have been proud to bestride, and made a special present to Eleanor of a new pony chair that had gained a prize in the exhibition. Nor did he even stay his hand here. He bought a set of cameos for his wife, and a sapphire bracelet for Miss Bold, showered pearls and work boxes on his daughters, and to each of his sons he presented a cheque for £20. On Mr Harding he bestowed a magnificent violoncello, with all the new-fashioned arrangements and expensive additions, which, on account of these novelties, that gentleman could never use with satisfaction to his audience or pleasure to himself. Those who knew the Archdeacon well perfectly understood the causes of his extravagance. It was thus that he sang his song of triumph over Mr Slope. This was his paean, his hymn of thanksgiving, his loud oration. He had girded himself with his sword and gone forth to the war. Now he was returning from the field laden with the spoils of the foe. The cob and the cameos, the violoncello and the pianoforte, were all, as it were, trophies reft from the tent of his now conquered enemy. The Arabins, after their marriage, went abroad for a couple of months, according to the custom in such matters now duly established, and then commenced their deanery life under good auspices. And nothing can be more pleasant than the present arrangement of ecclesiastical affairs in Barchester. The titular bishop never interfered, and Mrs Proudie not often.
Her sphere is more extended, more noble, and more suited to her ambition than that of a cathedral city. As long as she can do what she pleases with the diocese, she is willing to leave the dean and chapter to themselves."
Mr Slope tried his hand at subverting the old established customs of the close, and from his failure she had learnt experience. The burly chancellor and the meagre little prebendary are not teased by any application respecting Sabbath-day schools. The dean is left to his own dominions, and the intercourse between Mrs Proudie and Mrs Arabin is confined to a yearly dinner given by each to the other.
At these dinners Dr Grantly will not take a part, but he never fails to ask for and receive a full account of all that Mrs Proudie either does or says.
His ecclesiastical authority has been greatly shorn since the palmy days in which he reigned supreme as mayor of the palace to his father, but nevertheless such authority as is now left to him he can enjoy without interference. He can walk down the High Street of Barchester without feeling that those who see him are comparing his claims with those of Mr Slope. The intercourse between Plumstead and the Deanery is of the most constant and familiar description. Since Eleanor has been married to a clergyman, and especially to a dignitary of the church, Mrs Grantly has found many more points of sympathy with her sister, and on a coming occasion, which is much looked forward to by all parties, she intends to spend a month or two at the Deanery. She never thought of spending a month in Barchester when little Johnny Bold was born. The two sisters do not quite agree on matters of church doctrine, though their differences are of the most amicable description. Mrs Arabin's church is 2 degrees higher than that of Mrs Grantly. This may seem strange to those who will remember that Eleanor was once accused of partiality to Mr Slope, but it is no less the fact. She likes her husband's silken vest, she likes his adherence to the rubric, she specially likes the eloquent philosophy of his sermons, and she likes the red letters in her own prayer book. It must not be presumed that she has a taste for candles, or that she is at all astray about the real presence, but she has an inkling that way. She sent a handsome subscription towards certain very heavy ecclesiastical legal expenses which have lately been incurred in Bath, her name of course not appearing. She assumes a smile of gentle ridicule when the Archbishop of Canterbury is named, and she has put up a memorial window in the cathedral. Mrs Grantly, who belongs to the High and Dry Church, the High Church as it was some 50 years since, before tracts were written, and young clergymen took upon themselves the highly meritorious duty of cleaning churches, rather laughs at her sister. She shrugs her shoulders and tells Miss Thorne that she supposes Eleanor will have an oratory in the Deanery before she has done, but she is not on that account a whit displeased. A few High Church vagaries do not, she thinks, sit amiss on the shoulders of a young dean's wife. It shows at any rate that her heart is in the subject, and it shows moreover that she is removed, wide as the poles asunder, from that cesspool of abomination in which it was once suspected that she would wallow and grovel. Anathema Maranatha. Let anything else be held as blessed, so that that be well cursed. Welcome kneelings and bowings, welcome matins and complines, welcome bell, book and candle, so that Mr Slope's dirty surplices and ceremonial Sabbaths be held in due execration. If it be essentially and absolutely necessary to choose between the two, we are inclined to agree with Mrs Grantly that the bell, book and candle are the lesser evil of the two. Let it, however, be understood that no such necessity is admitted in these pages. Dr Arabin, we suppose he must have become a doctor when he became a dean, is more moderate and less outspoken on doctrinal points than his wife, as indeed in his station it behoves him to be. He is a studious, thoughtful, hard-working man. He lives constantly at the Deanery, and preaches nearly every Sunday. His time is spent in sifting and editing old ecclesiastical literature, and in producing the same articles new. At Oxford he is generally regarded as the most promising clerical ornament of the age. He and his wife live together in perfect mutual confidence. There is but one secret in her bosom which he has not shared. He has never yet learned how Mr Slope had his ears boxed. The Stanhopes soon found that Mr Slope's power need no longer operate to keep them from the delight of their Italian villa. Before Eleanor's marriage they had all migrated back to the shores of Como. They had not been resettled long before the Signora received from Mrs Arabin a very pretty, though very short epistle, in which she was informed of the fate of the writer. This letter was answered by another, bright, charming, and witty, as the Signora's letters always were, and so ended the friendship between Eleanor and the Stanhopes. One word of Mr Harding, and we have done. He is still precentor of Barchester, and still pastor of the little church of St Cuthbert's. In spite of what he has so often said himself, he is not even yet an old man. He does such duties as fall to his lot well and conscientiously, and is thankful that he has never been tempted to assume others for which he might be less fitted. The author now leaves him in the hands of his readers, not as a hero, not as a man to be admired and talked of, not as a man who should be toasted at public dinners, and spoken of with conventional absurdity as a perfect divine, but as a good man, without guile, believing humbly in the religion which he has striven to teach, and guided by the precepts which he has striven to learn. End of chapter 53. End of Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom.